"You don't belong up here," she said, pointing to the stairs like I was some stray she'd found wandering in from outside. "The basement is perfectly fine for you." I grabbed my pillow and my one box of things, and I walked down those stairs without a single word. But I made a promise to myself that night, standing in the dark at the bottom of those steps, that one day I would own every inch of the house she thought was hers. 16 years later, I did. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mara, and I was 10 years old when my father married Diane. I want to be fair here, because I think being fair matters even when no one ever extended that same courtesy to me. At first, Diane wasn't cruel. She was simply cold. There's a difference, and it took me years to understand it. Cruel is a decision. Cold is a disposition. Diane didn't decide to dislike me. She just never decided to like me either, and in a house where decisions shaped everything, that indifference was its own kind of sentence. She had a daughter, Cassie, 2 years younger than me, with soft blonde curls and a laugh that filled whatever room she walked into. My father, to his credit, tried in those early days. He would ruffle my hair at breakfast and ask about school and sit beside me on the couch when we watched television. But marriage has a gravitational pull, and slowly, quietly, without any single dramatic moment I could point to, he drifted into the orbit Diane built around herself and Cassie, and I was left rotating somewhere on the outer edge, close enough to see the warmth, but too far to feel it. We lived in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It was not a grand house, but it had a nice yard and a kitchen that smelled like vanilla when Diane baked, which she did often, for Cassie's school events and church fundraisers, and the neighbors she worked hard to impress. I had a bedroom on the second floor for those first 4 years, a small room, but mine. I kept it neat because neatness was one of the few things I had complete control over. I made my bed every morning, even when no one checked, even when no one cared. I hung my drawings on the wall with blue tack and kept my books stacked in alphabetical order on the shelf and told myself that order was a kind of dignity. I believed that for a long time. The small things accumulated the way small things do, quietly and without announcement. Cassie's recitals were on the family calendar in Diane's careful handwriting. Mine were not. When school photos came back, Cassie's went into a frame on the mantel. Mine went into a drawer in the kitchen, the one that held batteries and rubber bands and things no one knew what to do with. At Christmas, Cassie's gifts were wrapped in the good paper, the thick glossy kind with ribbon curled by scissors. Mine were wrapped in whatever was left, sometimes the same paper reused from a shopping bag. These things sound small when you list them. Maybe they were small, but they were every year, and they added up into a portrait of who mattered and who was tolerated. And even at 10, even at 11, even at 12, I could see that portrait clearly. When I was 14, Diane's mother came to visit. Her name was Rosalind, and she was a small, sharp-tongued woman from Georgia who smelled like rose water and disapproval in equal measure. She came for what was supposed to be 2 weeks and stayed for 8 months. The first thing Diane said when Rosalind arrived, in my presence, without looking at me, was, "We'll figure out the sleeping arrangements." The second thing she said, 3 days later, to my father, which I overheard from the hallway, was, "Mara doesn't really need that room. She's adaptable. Rosalind has a bad back." My father said, "Are you sure?" Diane said, "It's only temporary." That word temporary was still echoing off the basement walls 2 years later when I turned 16, because Rosalind stayed. And when Rosalind eventually left, 9 months after she arrived, Diane had already redecorated my old room into a craft space. She'd painted it a soft sage green and filled it with a cutting table and a sewing machine and bins of fabric organized by color. She showed it to Cassie like it was a gift. Cassie clapped and said it was so pretty. My father walked past the doorway, glanced in, and went downstairs to watch the game. And I stood in the hallway holding a glass of water I come up to refill, looking at the room that used to have my drawings on the wall. And I understood then, in a way I hadn't fully understood before, that no one in that house was going to advocate for me. Not even the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. So I was going to have to advocate for myself. The basement was finished technically. That's what Diane always said when anyone asked, and her tone made it clear that she felt this fact should resolve any discomfort on my part. It's a finished basement, she'd say. Like that settled it. Like square footage negated everything else. Yes, it had drywall and a concrete floor they'd covered with a remnant carpet, the color of old grass. Yes, it had a single window near the ceiling that showed me nothing but the underside of the yard and the occasional pair of legs walking past. Yes, it had a folding table I used as a desk and a bare bulb I replaced myself when it burned out. What it did not have was natural light in any meaningful quantity. What it did not have was a lock on the door at the bottom of those stairs, so anyone could walk in at any time, and Cassie did often without knocking, usually to borrow something she decided she needed. What it did not have was heat that reached the far corner where my bed was, which meant I slept in sweaters from October to April and learned to tell the temperature of a room by the weight of my own breathing. I had a teacher that year named Mr. Aldridge who taught American history and who had the particular gift of making dead people feel urgent. He stayed after class one afternoon when I was 16 and asked me plainly if everything was okay at home. I didn't know what he'd seen or what had tipped him off. Maybe it was the way I sat in the back corner and watched the clock in the last 10 minutes of class, calculating how long before I had to go back. Maybe it was the sweater I wore on a warm September day, because it was the only thing I had that was thick enough for the basement mornings. I told him things were fine. He looked at me in the specific way that teachers look at you when they know you're lying, but respect you enough not to push. Then he said, "You're one of the sharpest students I've had in 15 years. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I thanked him and left and sat in the bathroom for 5 minutes with my back against the cold tile wall. That was the first time in years that anyone had said something to me that was purely mine. No qualifier, no condition attached. I carried that sentence around in my chest for a long time after. I never complained to my father. I want to be honest about that. Part of me believed, in a way I'm not proud of, that if I was quiet and undemanding and grateful enough, he would see it. He would notice on his own and do something about it. That belief kept me compliant for 2 years. It was also completely wrong. He saw what he chose to see, which was a daughter who seemed fine, and a wife who kept the household running, and a life that didn't require him to have any difficult conversations. I was 14 and then 15 and then 16, and by 16 I understood that waiting to be rescued was a plan that was going to fail me every single time. So I stopped waiting. I got a job at a diner 3 blocks from school, washing dishes on weekday afternoons and waitressing on weekends. I told Diane about it the morning after I was hired, partly because I needed to and partly because I wanted to see her face. She looked at me with something I couldn't entirely read, something between suspicion and dismissal, and said, "Don't let it affect your grades." That was the whole conversation. No ask about why I wanted to work. No acknowledgement that maybe a 16-year-old sleeping in a cold basement with no pocket money had reasons to seek independence. Just that one flat sentence, and then she turned back to whatever she was doing. Fine, I thought. Fine. I don't need your understanding. I just need your silence. I worked that job for 2 years. I saved nearly everything I made because I didn't have much to spend it on and because saving felt like the only direction that mattered. I opened a savings account at the bank on Oak Street without telling anyone in that house. I rode my bike there on a Tuesday afternoon, sat across from a woman named Patricia who was kind and efficient, and walked out with a little blue booklet that was the first document in my adult life that was entirely mine. I kept that booklet inside my copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, which felt appropriate in a way I only fully appreciated years later. I worked through the end of high school and into the summer after graduation, and when I left for college on a partial scholarship and a handful of grants I'd applied for myself, I did not cry at the door. I hugged my father, who looked for just a moment like he wanted to say something true. He didn't. I nodded at Diane. I waved at Cassie. And I walked to the cab I'd called with money I'd earned myself, and I didn't look back at that house once. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be in a room where no one had already decided what I was. I was a student, and then a good student, and then the kind of student professors remembered and recommended. I studied accounting because I'd fallen in love with the way numbers told the truth about a situation, even when people were lying about it. There is something deeply satisfying about a balance sheet. Everything is accounted for. Every discrepancy has a source. Nothing is lost, only mislabeled, and with enough patience you can find where anything went wrong. I think I was drawn to it because I'd spent so much of my childhood in a situation where the numbers, so to speak, never added up, where I was told things were fair when every observable fact said otherwise, and accounting gave me a language for that gap. I also learned in college what it meant to be chosen, not tolerated, not managed, actually chosen. My roommate freshman year was a girl named Deja from Detroit, who laughed loudly and cooked elaborate meals on the 2-burner hot plate we weren't supposed to have, and who told me, about 3 weeks into the semester, that I was the most self-contained person she'd ever met, and she meant it as a compliment, but also as a question. I didn't know how to answer her then. I just knew that the self-containment had been necessary once, and I wasn't sure yet how to put it down. By our second year, Deja had made it her quiet project to pull me out of it, not aggressively, not with interventions or long talks, but by simply including me in things and acting like my presence was a given rather than a favor. She would knock on my door and say, "We're getting food," and it wasn't an invitation so much as a statement of fact, and I would go, and slowly I started to understand that being wanted didn't have to feel like a trap. Deja became my closest friend. She is still my closest friend. She is the person who drove 4 hours to sit with me the week after my father's funeral and asked nothing of me except that I eat something and sleep. Some people find their family in the house they grow up in. I found mine later. I think mine is better for the wait. The career side of things moved the way I needed it to move, which was forward and upward and on a schedule I controlled. I graduated with honors. I got a job at a mid-sized accounting firm in Cincinnati, entry level, which is the only place anyone starts. And I treated every assignment like it was an audition for something bigger, because it was. The partner who supervised my first year was a woman named Helena, who was exacting and unsentimental, and who told me at my 6-month review that I had the best instincts for pattern recognition she'd seen in a junior associate in a long time. I thanked her and went back to my desk and sat for a moment with that sentence before I let myself move on. I had learned by then to receive good things gracefully rather than suspiciously, though it still took effort. I got promoted twice in 4 years. I moved into a senior associate role that came with a real salary and the kind of responsibility I had been ready for since I was 22. I bought a used car that was mine. I rented an apartment that was mine, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with windows on 2 sides, and morning light that hit the kitchen counter at an angle I never got tired of. I built a life that was square foot by square foot and dollar by dollar, entirely and completely mine. I was not flashy about any of it. I didn't post things on social media or send updates home. I just built, quietly and steadily, the way I had learned to do anything that mattered, with my head down and my eyes forward, and the little blue booklet principle applied to everything I touched. I talked to my father occasionally, phone calls on holidays, sometimes a visit on his birthday. Diane was always in the background of those calls, a presence I could feel even through the phone. Cassie got married young to a man named Todd who sold insurance and coached Little League. They moved into a house 2 streets over from my father and Diane. When my father told me about this, he sounded proud in a way that was specific and unconscious, the way people sound when they describe the outcome they hoped for. I said that was wonderful. I meant it. I just noticed it. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I kept the record of things I was done being hurt by. What I didn't know in those years of building my own life in Cincinnati was that my father's health was beginning to fail. He had a heart that was working harder than it should, and he hadn't told me. And I don't know whether that was Diane's influence or his own stubborn privacy or both. I found out the same way I found out about most things in that family accidentally, through a comment that wasn't meant for me. It was at his 62nd birthday dinner, the one visit I made that year. Diane said something to Cassie in the kitchen, something about when the time comes and the arrangement, and I caught it through the doorway and felt the floor shift slightly under me. After dinner, I pulled my father aside and asked him directly, the way I learned to ask for things in the years since I stopped waiting for them to be offered. He told me about his heart condition with the tone of someone who'd already accepted the outcome and was now just managing paperwork. He told me the house was in both his and Diane's names. He told me he'd updated his will and that I was in it, but that the house would go to Diane in the event of his death, as was natural and fair. That word again, fair. I asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the evening. I drove back to Cincinnati that night, 5 hours, and I didn't play any music. I just drove and thought. I thought about the basement. I thought about the savings account and the little blue booklet and the Count of Monte Cristo sitting on my childhood shelf that I'd taken when I left. I thought about the word arrangement and the way Diane had said it with the calm of someone who had already planned what came next. And somewhere on the dark stretch of highway between Dayton and Cincinnati, a thought surfaced that I turned over very carefully, the way you turn a coin over to check both sides before you decide it's real. My father was not well. The house would go to Diane. Diane would do what Diane always did, which was manage things to her own advantage and call it fairness. And unless something changed, that house, the one with the basement, the one with the craft room where my bedroom used to be, would remain exactly what it had always been, a place I was allowed to exist in at someone else's pleasure and on their terms. I called a real estate attorney in Columbus on a Monday morning. I introduced myself as someone who was doing preliminary research. I asked questions. I listened carefully. I took notes on a yellow legal pad, and then I transferred those notes to a spreadsheet, because some habits are just part of who you are. Over the following months, while continuing to do my job and my life, I researched the Columbus market. I tracked the neighborhood where my father's house sat. I learned what similar properties had sold for in the past 5 years. I drove out to Columbus on 2 separate weekends and walked the surrounding blocks alone, noting what had been renovated and what hadn't, which properties had been flipped and what they'd gone for, which streets were drawing younger buyers. I was doing what I'd always done, gathering information in private so that when the moment came, I would be the most prepared person in the room. I calculated what renovations would cost and what they would return. I built a spreadsheet with 3 different scenarios: conservative, moderate, and optimistic, and I stress tested each one against interest rate changes and my existing savings. I spoke to a mortgage broker named Glenn, who had a direct manner I appreciated and who told me, without being asked for flattery, that my credit score and my debt-to-income ratio put me in an unusually strong position for someone my age. I already knew this. I had built this position deliberately over years with exactly this kind of moment in mind, even when I couldn't have named what the moment would be. There was a night in that period, a Wednesday in November, when I was sitting at my kitchen counter in Cincinnati with the spreadsheet open and a cup of tea gone cold beside me. And I had to stop and ask myself whether what I was doing was reasonable. Not legally, not financially, but emotionally. Whether buying that house was an act of healing or an act of obsession. I sat with that question for a long time. I thought about the basement and the craft room and the Christmas wrapping and the school photos in the kitchen drawer. I thought about Mr. Aldridge and Deja and the little blue booklet. I thought about what it would mean to walk through the front door of that house as its owner, to wake up in the morning and have not 1 square inch of it belong to anyone else's judgment or permission. And I decided that the line between healing and obsession is where the motivation lives. Revenge wants to watch someone lose. What I wanted was simply to win. There is a difference, and I knew which side of it I was on. I closed the laptop and went to bed and slept better than I had in months. I did not speak to my father about any of it. I did not speak to Diane. I was not ready to speak, and I was not ready for them to know I was thinking. And I had learned a long time ago that the most important plans are the ones you keep entirely to yourself until the moment arrives to act on them. My father passed away on a Thursday in March, 4 years after that birthday dinner conversation. He was 66. He died at home, which is what he'd wanted, and Diane called me to tell me with a voice that was composed in the way of someone who has already processed the grief and moved on to the logistics. I flew to Columbus the next morning. Deja offered to come. I told her I'd call her when I landed, and I did, and she stayed on the phone with me for an hour from her kitchen in Detroit while I sat in the airport waiting for my bag, and neither of us said much, which was exactly what I needed. I held the funeral together in ways that Diane seemed to expect without acknowledging, coordinating with the funeral home and reaching out to my father's old friends and making sure the catering for the reception was handled, because the alternative was chaos, and I did not want my father's last day remembered as chaos. Cassie cried beautifully, the way she did most things, in a way that drew the room's attention and sympathy. I sat quietly and felt the loss in the private, sealed way I'd learned to feel things. The way you feel things when you grew up in a house where your feelings were not considered important enough to inconvenience anyone. My grief for my father was real, and it was complicated, and it had layers I am still working through, because losing a parent who half loved you is a specific kind of loss that doesn't have a clean name. You mourn the person, and you mourn the version of them that never quite showed up. And sometimes it's hard to tell those two griefs apart. I found myself crying in the shower the morning after the funeral, not for the things he'd failed to do, but for a specific memory I hadn't thought of in years. The 2 of us at a baseball game when I was 8, before Diane, before all of it. and he'd bought me a hot dog and a lemonade, and I'd fallen asleep on his shoulder in the 7th inning. And when I woke up, we were still there, just the two of us, waiting for the final out. That man existed. I knew him once. I held on to that memory in the days following the funeral, the way you hold on to a railing on an unsteady boat. It was enough. It had to be enough. After the funeral, after the reception, after the last of the guests had gone and Cassie and Todd had driven back to their house 2 streets over, I was in the kitchen washing dishes because I needed something to do with my hands. And Diane came in and sat at the table and said, "I suppose you'll want to know about the will." I said yes. She told me what my father had told me at 62. The house was hers. There was a monetary sum for me, which was modest, but not nothing. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of, Diane said, and the way she said it, with a small nod, as if she'd been personally responsible for this generosity, made my jaw tighten slightly in a way she couldn't see, because I was facing the sink. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands. I went down to the basement, because that was still the room I stayed in when I came back to that house. And I sat on the edge of the old bed and I breathed slowly, and I reminded myself that the coin had 2 sides, and I had already checked both. 3 months after my father's funeral, Diane called me. She led with small talk, which she rarely did, which told me something was coming. Then she told me that she was thinking of moving, that the house was too big for one person, that Cassie and Todd had found her a lovely condo in a development near their neighborhood, one of those places with a clubhouse and a garden and organized activities, and she thought it sounded nice. "The house," she said with a pause that was doing a lot of work, "will need to be sold." I said that sounded like a reasonable plan. I asked if she'd spoken to a realtor. She said not yet. I said, "Before you do that, I'd like to make you an offer." Another pause, longer this time. "Then, you want to buy the house?" I said, "I've been thinking about it, yes." I named a figure. It was fair. I had done months of research to make sure it was fair, because I wanted it to be fair, because I was nothing like the people who'd raised me. She said she'd have to think about it. I said, of course. Take all the time you need. I kept my voice easy and warm and gave absolutely nothing away. She came back to me 10 days later. She said she'd had someone look at the property value and my number was in the right range, and she supposed it made sense to keep it in the family. That phrase, in the family. I let it sit there without commenting on it. I said I was glad. I said I'd have my attorney reach out. The closing took 6 weeks. I flew to Columbus on a Tuesday, sat across a table from Diane and 2 attorneys and a notary, signed my name in the places indicated, and handed over a cashier's check that represented 12 years of disciplined saving and smart borrowing, and a credit history I had built from absolute zero when I was 16 years old with a dishwashing job and a little blue bank booklet. When it was done, Diane stood and shook my hand, and her grip was firm and her expression was unreadable, and she said, "I hope you'll be happy here." I said, "I will be." That was the whole conversation. I gave her 60 days to vacate, which was generous, and I knew it was generous, and I offered it without being asked because that is who I am. She was out in 52. The last thing she moved was the sewing machine from the craft room, the room that used to be mine. I watched from the driveway as Todd carried it to their car, and I felt something I hadn't expected, which was not triumph exactly, not the sharp satisfaction I'd imagined in the basement at 16. It was quieter than that. It was more like a door closing on a room you'd been locked out of for years, and you finally had the key, and instead of rushing and angry, you just stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed. I gutted the craft room first. I took down the sage green paint and the cutting table and the fabric bins. I had the walls skimmed and repainted a warm white. I put up shelves. I put my books on them, including The Count of Monte Cristo, in the spot on the third shelf where my eye naturally fell when I walked in. I put up framed prints of drawings I'd made over the years, echoes of the ones I'd hung with blue tack when I was 10 years old and believed that order was a kind of dignity. I understand now that order isn't dignity. Agency is dignity. The ability to decide what hangs on your own walls, what color you paint them, who is welcome to walk through the door and who is not. I had none of that at 10. I have all of it now. I renovated the basement last because I wanted to do it right and because I wanted to understand what I was doing before I did it. I had the window widened to full egress size. I had proper insulation installed in the far corner where the cold used to pool. I put in warm lighting and a real lock on the door at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't turn it into a bedroom. I turned it into a library and a workspace, a room with bookshelves floor to ceiling, and a good desk and a reading chair by the window that now showed the yard at its proper height. Some people who hear this story ask me why I kept the basement at all, why I didn't just seal it off or use it for storage. And I tell them the same thing every time, because it deserved to become something good. Because a room that was used to diminish someone shouldn't end its story that way. Turning it into a place of peace and work and books was more satisfying than tearing it out would have been. I sit down there most mornings now in that chair by the window with my coffee, watching the yard wake up. It is the best room in the house. I made it that way on purpose. Cassie texted me about 8 months after I moved in. She was friendly in the tentative way of someone who isn't sure whether an apology is owed, but suspects it might be. She said the house looked great from the outside. She'd driven past. She hoped I was doing well. I thanked her. I meant it. Cassie was never the villain of my story. She was someone who benefited from an unfair situation she hadn't created and probably never fully examined, and that made her thoughtless rather than cruel, and I had enough energy to make the distinction. We have lunch occasionally now when I'm in Columbus and she's free. We talk about neutral things, and it's fine. It is what it is. Diane I've seen twice since the closing. Once at a neighborhood event I attended shortly after moving in, where we were briefly in the same room and exchanged a nod across it. Once at Cassie's younger daughter's birthday party, where we spoke for about 4 minutes with perfect politeness and nothing underneath it. I don't hate her. I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes people tell stories like this, and what they want is for the listener to hate the antagonist on their behalf. And I'm not asking for that. What Diane did was real, and it was wrong, and it shaped me in ways I'm still discovering. But carrying hatred for her would mean carrying her with me, and I put her down a long time ago. She can live her life in her condo near Cassie. I'll live mine in the house I bought. My father. I think about most. I think about him at the kitchen table in the mornings when I drink my coffee in the room where he used to read his paper. I think about the moment at 62 when he looked like he wanted to say something true and didn't. I don't know what that thing was, and I'll never know, and I have made a kind of peace with that uncertainty. He loved me, I believe, in the partial way of a person who wasn't brave enough to love at full capacity, and partial love is still love, just not enough of it and not in the right places. I keep a photo of him on the shelf in the library, not to punish myself with it, just to keep him in the story, in his right place, neither larger nor smaller than he was. Last summer, I sat in the backyard, the one Diane used to tend so carefully to impress the neighbors, and I watched the sun go down behind the trees at the edge of the property line, the same trees I used to stare up at through that narrow basement window when I needed to remember that the world was larger than the room I'd been assigned. The yard looks different now. I planted things I wanted rather than things that would impress anyone. There are tomatoes along the south fence and lavender near the porch steps and a small apple tree I put in last fall that won't give me fruit for another 2 years and that I am perfectly content to wait for. I have learned, if nothing else, how to wait for things that are worth having. I thought about the girl who had stood at the bottom of those basement stairs at 16 with a pillow and a box of things and a promise she was making to herself in the dark. I thought about how small she felt and how large she refused to let that feeling make her seem, even to herself, even alone. I thought about the drawing she'd made at age 11, a floor plan of her ideal house, rooms with big windows and a garden and a library, the one that Diane had picked up off the kitchen table once and said, very gently, that it might be good to have more realistic goals. That drawing existed somewhere in a box in my closet now. I had found it when I was packing up Cincinnati. I had held it for a long time before I folded it back up and kept it. I wanted to tell that girl something. I wanted to tell her that the coldness she was feeling was not a reflection of her worth, that the room they'd given her was the least interesting thing about her, that she would carry herself out of that basement and out of that house and back into it on her own terms, and every inch of it would be hers, paid for with her own hands and her own years, and her own absolute refusal to believe that the story they were writing for her was the one she had to live in. I think she would have believed me. I think she was already working toward exactly that, even then, even at 16, even in the dark. If someone has ever tried to put you in a room that doesn't match who you are and told you to be grateful for it, I want you to hear this. The house of your life is yours to design. Don't let anyone hand you the basement and call it a gift. Know your worth. Build accordingly. And when the time comes, own the whole thing.